I am Jeanna Gomez. I am the Master Crafts Artisan at the Fifth Avenue Theater. And I've been there, I sort of calculated, I had to think about it. I've been there pretty much exclusively for about 8 years now. And before that, for about 8 years previously to that, I went back and forth working there and the opera. And then before that, I was at Act Theater when I first moved to Seattle in 1999. So it was totally an accident. I thought that I wanted to be a geologist. So when I was doing my undergrad, I had been in a high school that had no arts program. It was a thing that they did in the 80s, which was like a, back to basics thing. So there was no arts class. So I'd never taken any arts classes. So when I was in college, I was trying to figure out what science major I wanted to do, and sort of discovering along the way that I kind of sucked at science. And I decided that I would take an art class. So I went into this costume design class and I just loved it. So yeah, it kind of, I ended up segueing into a theater arts major. So that's what I did. That's what I got my bachelor's, is theater arts at UC Santa Cruz. And then I started from there. I started working. They had a theater festival there called Shakespeare Santa Cruz. And I would segue working there in the summertime, and it was really fun. So I started doing wardrobe and, doing crafts notes and just flying by the seat of my pants. People were, I had some good mentors. I learned some cool stuff. I learned that I started to learn to sew. I had no sewing experience before then, none at all. In fact, one of the first things that I did, the first sewing experience that I got was like a theater workshop tech class where we had to sew things. And I think I took the shop manager's shears and tried to cut a pin with them or something like that, something really bad. Now I know, obviously, that that's really, really bad, but the amazing thing is that people were kind and I actually learned. Yeah, so that was my auspicious beginning in theater. So it just kind of went from there. I ended up, after I left college, sort of gigging around, finding little summer festivals to work on. And then also, I worked at an alterations shop. I mean, I just tried to survive. I was totally poor, relatively unskilled. I did alterations. I worked in a sewing factory where we did piecework and practically starved to death because I, was pretty slow. And what else? I ended up working in regional dinky theaters in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and in Crossville, Tennessee, before I got my big break working at Act Theater as the shop assistant in 1999. And so yeah, that was my path. It was sort of like a pinball machine, I think. There was nothing very premeditated about it. So yeah. We have a pretty condensed build, and for the most part, we're taking in a rental package and fluff and buff is what we call it. So what that means is that we may pull out the rats, or any costumes that the designer really, really hates, and we want to redo new things for the principals and stuff. But what that basically means is mostly we're using the chorus stuff, unless there's a number that they hate, and then we rebuild that. So the first couple of days, we're just sort of wrapping our heads around what might be the build projects that we have on that particular show and how fast we're going to scramble to get it done. I would say the tricky part about the crafts job at the Fifth in particular is that they figure out what they're doing in rehearsal. We're going forward, but I don't necessarily know when I'm building it because it comes out of rehearsal. So a lot of my job is a lot of detective work where I'm sleuthing around, bothering people, asking stage management questions, trying to sniff out information about who needs what and what it has to do. That's the other thing, is usually the crafty stuff has a job to do. It's often the trick stuff. So it's something that, you know, you need to have all the information on before you actually even start it, because if they didn't tell you that they put it on stage, that affects how you might have built it. On the super busy build shows, I usually get help, like assistants and things like that to help me. And if it's not a heavy build show, then it's just mostly me. And then a different thing that is maybe a little unusual about the Fifth Avenue is I don't do shoes. They have a shoes and skins person. So shoes are not on my plate unless I have nothing to do and then I help the shoe person, or unless there's, like, for example, gaiters or boot tops or something like that. I mean, these are dancers, so they need dance shoes, and that's a whole job in itself. She does shoes and skins, so I don't worry about that. So I end up doing a lot more dyeing and prep work for the rest of the shop, stuff that they need me to do so that they can move on with their builds. That's usually how I'm front loaded. And then as my actual notes come out of rehearsal, then I got really busy at the end. And I also at that point have to be working with hair and with sound, because they're all mic'd. So hats are kind of a thing. They got to go on the hair. So that means I work with the hair person, and we make sure that, you know, they can work with the wig and come on and off without messing the hair up too much, and figuring out all that kind of stuff. And then also that they're not like shading the face. Oftentimes, because there's so much singing and there's a microphone, usually the mic is right here. There's a lot of issues with hats. And so they might need, like, if there's a brim there, sound can get hysterical because it will bounce the mic sound. And so there's oftentimes like, can we move the mic? Can we, you know, there's just a lot of dialoguing that has to happen whenever there is a hat, and however the hat transitions through the number. Sometimes a person puts it on in the middle of the number and takes it off, so then they have to figure out the miking and the hair so that it doesn't get messed up. And, you know, it also can't be attached to their head with horsehair, which is normally how you do it if they're going to go run out and do cartwheels and whatever like they do. You don't want it to fly off. So yeah, those are some of the sort of typical challenges. But I'm also, because they're typical, I'm kind of used to who I got to talk to and who I got to go pester and say, hey, I heard there's a hat. How do you want to do the mics? How do you want to, you know what I mean? All this kind of stuff. So we work together. It's very collaborative, and I kind of love that about it. So. My job is to get it functioning as best as I can for everybody. And so it's like being a servant with many masters, but it's fun, you know, it's really fun. And I do think people have the mistaken idea that you're like a slave to the designer and what it's supposed to look like. And ultimately that is a factor. Obviously you want to make your designer happy, but you also have to be the voice that says to the designer, now remember, it has to do all these things, because that's what it has a job to do besides just look like you want it to. And so I always have to start with, like, first it's got to do its job, then it's going to look like you want it to. They know how they want it to look, but they maybe don't know the action of it yet. And sometimes we just all have to wait for that to come out in rehearsal. So I would say the number one thing I have to do is work super, super fast, because by the time I get all the information, there's not a lot of time to fiddle around. But how I work with the designer is I mock ups. I do what I think is cool, and then I show it to them, and then they can say, oh, I hate that, or oh no, that's okay, or what if we change this, or whatever. But I find that I would rather like show them, because I'd rather have them say, I hate that, and then they have to give me a better idea of what they do want. And I basically puzzle out what I think is going to work with all the information that I have. It's going to make the performer happy. And for me, I put the performer's needs before anything else. They're the person who knows what they have to get it to do, and they're out there being a star and doing it. They have to make it work. So the people I work with are pros. They're amazing. They will do just about anything to get it done. So my job is to give them a thing that works. And they also need to have it, like, if I possibly can, like, as soon as I can, like, I will try, if it's a trick thing, I will try and get it to them in rehearsal. So they at least have it for a day or two before tech to try it out. And at that point, it's great, because if I can do that, then they can give me notes so that we go into tech, and it all works the first time is my goal. Like, when they're on tech, it's working. And then they have the time that they need to feel comfortable and build their confidence with the number that they're doing. And then also they can give me relevant notes, you know, instead of like, oh, this keeps falling off, this keeps falling off. They can say, you know, if it was just a little bit tighter right here, then I think I could make this work. And then that just dials it in faster. So a lot of it is about, so musical theater is fast. The pacing is really fast. With musical theater, the change time is often super fast, super fast. So they're like, you know, a 10-second change is not even that fast, you know, and that's fast. So I think that the gags and the tricks are really about, it has to go on really quickly and seamlessly. It has to work with the actions. You know, there's a point where she's got like a towel on her head and they wanted like a mud mask on her face. But obviously, she also had to like wipe it off, in theory, like wipe it off and then be in full makeup. You know what I mean? Like, she didn't have any time to change her makeup or wipe glop off her face. And so it was a matter of making a mask that ended up being on eyeglass stems, that when she went like this, she could pull it off, you know. And it, you know, frankly, it's not rocket science, but it's one of these kinds of things that you have to figure it out ahead of time. And a lot of it is interpretation in tech notes, because they're telling you, oh, we need this thing to do this stuff, and they don't know what they want. So you have to just try and give them something that will actually work. And so it's a lot of it, again, is just finding out what is it they need it to do. And then the notion that it looked like, you know, she's got mud or goo, like green goo on her face or something like that. Then so first you go, okay, it's got to be a mask. And how does she pull it off quickly? Well, you put wires, you know, it was not a big deal, but it's just the interpretation and giving them a thing to work with, so that they can practice with it and then tell you, you know, I need more space for my eyes, or whatever it is, and you trim that out. So that's maybe not a great example. Like, we were working on Sister Act, and a more typical example would be, you know, a hat that has to get put on stage and taken off on stage. There was a big number where there was like a big white fedora. And a very typical thing is that if a performer is going to wear a hat when they're singing or as part of a number, you got to put a mic in it. So, and then it still has to fit on their head. And so it's working with the sound department, because they'll already have a mic on there that's already rigged on, and then they have to switch, you know, when the microphone comes on, like the mic is out here so that it doesn't bounce. And so the hat still has to fit on the performer, in addition to the wig, and not mess up the hair. And so it has to just be this moment where another actor hands him the hat. He puts it on. He does his solo. He takes it off. He throws it off stage. You know what I mean? It's just that kind of, that's typical. That's very typical at the Fifth Avenue Theater. Putting microphones in hats and hiding them places so that it doesn't bounce the sound. there's a lot of like gags and switcheroos in musical theater, and a lot of the kind of dancing that they do is wild, and there's often fights, you know, fight dancing, and you know what I mean? Like, yeah. So like, as an example, like we can't have beaded necklaces on. There's also automation and stuff like that. There's certain things you can't have on the stage, because if they fight, it's going to break, and it's going to end up in an automation track, or it's going to end up all over the stage and that kind of stuff. But there is a lot of like, first this person wears this thing and they pass it to the other person, you know, it just gags, just a lot of like things that frankly, as an audience, you never would notice it, you just would never see it. But I think that's part of the theater magic, you know. Yeah, we have the building, that the Fifth Avenue Theater, I love it. The building was built in 1926, and it is basically the same. It has not really been that improved on, and it can't really be, just because of the nature of the old building. So yeah, we are very fortunate that we have space to work in, but we have a lot of us working in a pretty small space together. And I'm super lucky. You know, I have a couple little tables, but we all share. So it really depends how much space I get on any given show. Depends on many factors. I would say one of the biggest space challenges for me is that I can't house a lot of supplies. Like, I have a pretty limited area to have my paints and my dyes and my, you know, old crappy hats from the thrift store that I might or might not need. The thing is like, if I don't have them, the turnaround is usually so fast. Like, I don't usually, that's one of the hard parts about working at the Fifth Avenue Theater. I often don't have time to get supplies between the time when I really finally know what I'm building and how long I have to get it on stage is usually super fast. So I do have to have a certain amount of supplies. So it's tricky. Like, there's a lot of crap jammed under my table, and people wonder why I'm a slob. But, you know, number one, I am a slob. But number two, I need that stuff. And I can't tell you how many times I've pulled out some crappy thing and just been like, how can I make this into how can I make this into a thing, like, really fast? And honestly, like, if I have a superpower, that's what it is. Like, it's like, you know, I am not that great at like making the amazing things that I have seen people make, but at winging it, I can get that shit done. So that's why I love my job, because to me, that roller coaster ride is so fun. And I love pulling out the crap from under my table and turning it into something that can work for whatever it is that they need in, you know, 4 hours from now, you know. and that's the really fun thing. I think that's kind of like how we work at the Fifth Avenue Theater in general. I don't think it's just me. Like, other people there are tasked with like whipping stuff out really fast, and they do, and it's part of the thrill. You know, that it's a tricky one, because first of all, it depends on, and this is a very theater centric thing to say, but I guess it applies in a lot of ways. It's like, the first thing that you have to think about is the distance of your audience. Like, how far away are people going to be seeing this distressing? And, you know, how far away do they need to understand what they're looking at, you know? And I developed some techniques for the stage that I work on, which is like really far away, that do not work. Like, when I go back to act theater and I have to distress stuff, I'm like, oh no, because people are so close. And I've developed a really heavy hand with my distressing, because I'm used to like more texture. So what I will say is that the Fifth Avenue Theater, when you distress things, usually, so it's a whole different deal than how you would distress things, how I would distress things at the opera. And it's also totally different for how I would distress things at Act Theater, which is really, really close. The opera, people aren't as active. Not that people aren't active, but at the Fifth Avenue Theater, they are literally running, climbing the scenery. They are dancing, fighting, like super active. They get super sweaty and their stuff gets laundered all the time. Like their skin layers are getting washed after every show. So, and the outside cuffs, so basically like what that means is that I can't hurt those clothes. So I have to make them look hurt, but they still have to function, and they have to be worn show after show after show and not fall apart. So I had learned to do a lot of applied distressing, which means that it's all being put on, or if I'm cutting a hole out, we're backing it with a stretch material. You know what I mean? Like, for example, if there's a hole with the knee, we're putting fraying around it, but it's actually got mesh stretch there so that it's not going to continue to rip, because once you have a hole, it's going to want to tend to rip and keep getting bigger. So yeah, there's a lot of sewing and distressing, at least at the Fifth Avenue. But there's also some really fun, like if you're a fiber artist and you nerd out on like cool fiber appliques and stuff like that, you can do like some of the really coolest stuff that I have seen has been this attention to detail, applying frayed edges to garments and creating textural mends with big stitches, with embroidery thread. I've seen that where it actually sort of puckers up the fabric and it looks like, you know, just as an example for like Annie, like the orphan girls, like creating texture, at least on our stage, texture is what reads. Our lighting is so harsh that it flattens paint. So it used to be like when I worked at the opera, I could get away with a lot more with paint, highlight, and shadow, because the lights aren't as flattening there. They tend to have more moody lighting, and it just doesn't wash it out the way that a lot of the musical theater lighting does. So I broke it down into some distressing basics, which apply to all things. So this first thing that I do is what we call sag and bag. And that is the reshaping and the breaking of fibers. So the very first thing I do for almost any distressing, and even if I need it to still not hurt the garment, is that I basically will steam it or spritz it with water, throw it in a bag, and jump up and down on it. And what that does is that breaks all those fibers need to be broken in order to collapse. So this is in particular if you're given a brand new garment, which a lot of times, you know, in theater, they make you this brand new thing. It's not old, it's brand new fabric. So you have to start the process of beating it up. And I also like to do this because that always freaks out the cutters. It's just kind of fun to watch them squirm because they know that you have to do this to their clothes, but they've just put together a brand new thing, and then you basically, and they're all precious about it, and then you basically like spritz it, throw it in a bag, and start jumping on it, and they're just like, oh! So that's kind of fun. I enjoy that. I have to admit, I enjoy it quite a bit. They're used to it now. I can't really get anybody's coat at the Fifth Avenue anymore. So sag and bag, that's the very beginning. And then oftentimes, so after I've broken those fabrics, you put it on a form and you're just trying to like pull it down like into the shape of a human being that's worn it. And how you would have like put your hands in your pockets, those kinds of things that create natural sagging. So that's number one, sag and bag. Number two is texture. And that includes sanding, fraying, otherwise thinning the fabric. That's basically anything. We also call that physically distressing. But I also would include in the texture applying physical distress. So usually I rely a lot on the texture rather than, like, I do some sanding just to loosen the fibers, but I need the garment to still be durable. So I don't do a ton of that. A lot of times it's just like, if it's a velvet, it's just to break the nap up and stuff like that. But then I go to applying. So number one, sag and bag. Number two, figure out what your texture needs to be. And number three, the last one, is paint. And so for me, that's highlight and shadow is the main thing that you think about. Thinking about how a thing would fade. You want to work with highlights and shadows. I use a sponge, I use an airbrush, I use a squirter bottle. Like, they're all good for different things. Squirter bottle is really good for breakup, but you don't have a lot of control. Airbrush is really good for control, but it's really more of a toning kind of thing most of the time. And then sponge, I'm actually quite a fan of sponge because you can get it on there pretty quickly. And that's sort of like a sponge, I think of as kind of a top rub of grime. So yeah, and I use all of those things in phases, you know. I just do it. I usually start out when I do distressing is when we're going into tech, because I don't know what it's going to look like until it's up on stage with the lighting on, and then that will tell you like how much farther you have to go. So like that Quasimodo, there's some pictures of that Quasimodo that I did with that has some texture on it that was applied. You can see like that was built in our shop, and so it was like pristine and looked really hokey without any distressing on it. You know what I mean? It didn't look real. So like distressing is really great for taking a thing and making it look more real. And as far as I went in the pictures, like I'm pretty sure I had to go back at it again and add a lot more for it to show up on our stage. I'm pretty sure that was the midst of, you know, it went back out on stage. I looked at it. They looked at it. It wasn't enough. We did more. So, you know, it's at least in a theater context, it's a phase thing where you like, and the other thing was the blood, like Kelly started that. That was for Dracula. That was me. Was that Mina? That was Mina. And it had fabulous blood on it, but they wanted more blood. And, you know, that's the thing about blood is when there's blood, they usually want more blood. But you don't know, like as an artist, you can't start with too much blood. You can't start there because you've ruined the garment. So you have to start less, go into tech, they want more. And usually by the time they can see it on stage, they can tell you more clearly where they want it and how they want it to look. And that's a good thing. So you give them some distressing to start with, and then they tell you what more they want, like how to make it more, what they want to see. And that's good. So distressing is definitely like a process, at least in theater. And then the hardest kind of distressing is distressing at act theater, for example. You know, just when you distress, then you really have to work because that's all like real sandpaper and airbrush and very delicate work, because you can go too far and it looks really fake because the audience is really, really close. So that's tough right there, that kind of distressing for an intimate house, because it basically means you're doing all this physical distressing, which is hard on your body. That means you're like sanding all that stuff, you know, and they'll give you like jeans and overalls and stuff that's all brand new, and it's a total, you know, arm killer because you're like, ah. So yeah, I hope that's my like primer on distressing. Sag and bag, texture, and paint. So in various levels. I'm just here at home, so I was digging around. I don't have anything cool that I've made from the theater to show. But this was something that, this hat, I don't even know if it's going to read very well, but I'll put it on. This is a hat that I made to be like a 1940s style hat. And what it was an old beat up derby. And I didn't change anything about it. You can still see, still has the original edging. But this is just, I totally reshaped it. So I wanted to show this to your students, because you can just take things and screw around with them. Just play, you know, just play with them. And this was a matter of taking a dirty old nasty hat, and soaking it and cleaning it and washing it. And I did wash it pretty good. It needed some washing. But then I just molded it and played with it. This was just with my hands. And I love this thing. And doing that helped me learn, you know, because I had done that on my own, I have been able to do that when someone says, oh my God, whip out a hat, you know, what we've got, we don't like, this isn't working, whatever, just give me something. And that does happen a lot. Sometimes the designers, you get designs and they want this design, but there are plenty of times when they're like, chorus girl number 7 needs something on her head, go. You know what I mean? So in those moments, being able to have that in your, not just in your mind, but in your fingertips a little bit. Like, I have to tell you, like, my hands are my muse. Like, I don't feel like I get to take credit for 90% of the cool stuff I've ever made, because it was collaboration, but it was also like, these guys did it, you know, like I stepped out of the way and let my hands just go. And those are the times, I mean, the magic of theater for me is just that it takes my ego out of it. I just have to let that muse or whatever's needed flow through me. And I love it for that reason, because I don't question, like, my head is my worst enemy, like all the time. It's always telling me, that's stupid. Why would you do that? You know? And if I have no time to think about it, it's amazing what I can do. I'm always shocked. There's some crazy little wild little cat mask thing that I put, that's paper mache. That was like me and a roll of masking tape and some paper bags, you know, making the armatures totally like paper bags stuffed with newspaper. Like, it's just newspaper taped together with paper mache on it. Like, and then you unstuff it and then you put your head in it and you got a mask, you know. It's, you can do that. Like, everyone can get a bottle of Elmer's glue and some newspaper or paper bags, like, and that's, you know, when I was learning, that's what I would do. Because you don't have to have supplies. You don't have to have a lot of money. It is good to collect like a felt hat. Yeah, like if you see them, those are great things to pick up at the thrift store for $5 and play with. Just play with them. You know, cut the brim off, leave the wire in, twist it around, put it on your head. It's a fascinator. Boom, you're done. You know, figure out how to keep it on your head. There's another challenge, you know, like play, just play. And right now it's hard. I think it's killing me and everybody else that I know, that I can't go to the thrift store and like pick up supplies. But those are things that you can get, and that's a good way to just teach yourself things, is just play around, make things for yourself, make fascinators, you know, or just, you know, destroy things. Sometimes what you learn by wrecking things is just as good as what you learn by creating things. Like, you learn the fails, like that when I was first learning to block felt, you know, the times where I over nuked it in the microwave and it seized up completely. It's like, I was like, okay, don't do that, you know. That's too much. So yeah, like everything is a relevant experience, especially fails, you know, especially fails. The fails live in my mind. I have a terrible memory for my successes, but I do remember my failures. For my failures, I mean, I usually remember not to do that again. you know? So yeah. Look for mentors, you know, look for people who can teach things. They're out there. I would say I feel very blessed because all the best things that I learned because people were patient enough to guide me, you know, to help me out when I like either came to them or to frankly hire me, you know, and I got to earn while I learned. That's kind of great when you can find someone who's patient enough to help you through, you know, maybe you got a gig and you don't totally know what you're doing. You know, the person who's there to kind of say, well, try it this way, or, you know, just pay attention to that kind of stuff and foster those relationships, because there are a lot of people who are more than willing to talk to you, like, and aren't going to charge you money. Like, if you can find those people, they're more than willing to say, here, try this, or, you know, help you out. If you come to them and say, I've got this project I'm trying to do, what do you suggest? You know, just, you don't have to do exactly what they say, but just think you can learn from what other people have experience with. And then so yeah, I would say mentors. And then I would also say, for me, don't try to do it just on your own. This kind of goes along with mentors, but it's also like connect with other creative people, and people who are trying to do what you want to do. I mean, there is really something to, like, a big part of what I love about my job is being in the room with a bunch of other creative people, because this might sound a little woo-woo, but like, there is a vibe, there's a mental energy in the room. It's like a hive mind that like makes me smarter, because because by proxy I'm around these other people who are, you know, we're all just kind of like cooking in the same creative ocean, you know, in this little pond. And it's much harder for me to get creative when I'm not around those people. You know, there's something that really feeds your personal energy if you're around other creative people. And it doesn't mean that you're copying them. It's just it's just like the influence is bouncing around and you get to absorb it. You get to absorb, wow, look at my friend's really cool needlework, where I don't really do needlework, but I might steal that stitch to put on a hat, or, you know what I mean? This, like, those kind of things that might inspire you and might inspire your work. So I would say that's a big one. Yeah. My favorite projects have been the collaborative ones and the projects where I had the satisfaction and the glow that you get of working with a team where you succeeded in creating something, and it was all something that like everyone had their part in. You know, you may have just contributed one little part, but the whole was a big success. And I would say those are always my favorite projects, because the satisfaction of like knowing your designer is happy, and then also getting to sit in the audience and be like, yay, it worked, you know, and also sitting next to the people that you guys knocked yourself out to get it up there. You know, I think ultimately it's not just like the cool top hat that you got to make or the whatever. It's those projects where somehow you didn't think it was possible and you guys like made it happen. I would also say my favorite projects are the ones where I've had designers who are real collaborators, who really, like, there are some designers that because they believe in you, there's something about somebody believing in you that like you can do anything.